When the British Empire ruled across continents, it did not rely on armies alone. It used books. It used lessons that shaped young minds before they ever questioned authority. In schools from Africa to India, and the Caribbean to Southeast Asia, children learned about kings and queens they would never meet. They memorized maps drawn in London. They read history through another nation's eyes. This was not just education. This was instruction. This was the teaching of empire to the colonized. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today, and thank you for being here with me on this journey into the past. Today, we explore how the British Empire used education not only as a gift, not only as a tool, but sometimes as a strategy. A strategy that shaped identity, language, and loyalty. A strategy that opened doors for some, but closed others behind them. For many students, colonial schooling offered literacy, jobs, and opportunity. For others, it replaced older knowledge, erased traditions, and reshaped culture from the inside. So here is a question to think about before we begin. When empire taught the colonized, was it teaching for their future, or teaching for its own future? The first classrooms of control 1600 to 1700. The story begins at the edge of empire, long before armies occupied vast territories and before trade alone defined influence. In the early 17th century, British ships arrived at foreign ports with merchants, sailors, and missionaries aboard. Where these ships anchored, small structures appeared beside forts and trading posts. They were simple classrooms, built of wood or local materials, with books and slates. Their purpose seemed modest, yet their impact would reach far beyond their walls. Education began in the earliest days of empire, though it was not yet organized or formalized. Mission schools offered reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and religious instruction. Lessons were simple and practical, designed to serve immediate needs. Children learned to read scripture and letters, to write their names, and to perform calculations that could assist merchants or administrators. Religion intertwined with literacy, creating a dual purpose, moral guidance alongside practical skill. Teachers were often missionaries who had followed the traders. They arrived with faith, with conviction, and with a belief that knowledge could shape character. They taught patiently, using repetition and discipline, and adapted lessons to local languages and contexts. Sometimes students came willingly. Sometimes they were sent by families hoping to benefit from the opportunities these skills offered. Each classroom became a space where instruction extended beyond its immediate content. Beneath the lessons, a pattern appeared. While children were learning to read and write, they were also learning to interpret authority. The structure of the classroom reflected hierarchy. Teachers held power through knowledge. Students sat in rows, their attention directed by a single voice. Lessons emphasized obedience, attention, and respect. Through repetition and example, students began to understand that authority could be systematic, rational, and ordered. Maps and texts presented Britain at the center of the world. Geography lessons described distant lands not only as trading partners, but as places under influence, waiting to be guided. Stories of explorers, merchants, and administrators conveyed moral purpose and civilization. Students learned to admire Britannia's reach, to see it as both natural and benevolent. The narrative of empire was woven into literacy itself, shaping perception from an early age. School became the quiet beginning of influence. There were no soldiers in these classrooms, no flags raised, no force applied. Yet every lesson reinforced a worldview in which British presence was legitimate, expected, and beneficial. Knowledge became a subtle form of authority. Understanding the world through the pages provided was also understanding Britain's place within it. Compliance, respect, and loyalty were taught alongside reading and arithmetic. Students who mastered literacy and numeracy became clerks, interpreters, or assistants at trading posts. They recorded inventories, copied contracts, and facilitated communication. Their education served commerce and administration, extending the reach of British influence without visible intervention. A schoolroom became a node in the network that connected distant ports to London. Cultural exchange occurred, but it was guided by the perspective of the teachers. Missionaries translated texts and phrases, taught songs and prayers, and selected lessons that aligned with their objectives. Local knowledge was acknowledged only when it could be incorporated into the curriculum. The classroom became a controlled environment in which imperial perspectives were prioritized, creating a subtle but lasting form of shaping identity. The simplicity of the classrooms masked their long-term purpose. Lessons that seemed practical or moral were also lessons in hierarchy, authority, and worldview. Students internalized patterns of behavior and thought that supported British systems. They learned not only how to read, but how to interpret relationships of power. They learned not only arithmetic, but how systems could be measured, organized, and managed. Education became a tool of influence that traveled with the student beyond the walls of the school. By the late 17th century, a recognizable pattern had emerged. Wherever trading posts and forts were established, classrooms followed. Wherever classrooms appeared, authority gained reinforcement. Literacy and religion worked together to create consent and understanding. Shaping perception before policy was enacted and long before formal governance was imposed. The empire's presence became familiar, normalized, and quietly internalized. Families and communities adapted in response. Some embraced the opportunities offered by literacy and instruction. Others negotiated with the values being taught, blending traditional practices with the lessons provided. Not all outcomes were uniform, yet the system created a foundation on which influence could expand steadily. Even when classrooms were small, their effects were cumulative, stretching across generations. These first classrooms were modest, yet deliberate. They introduced skills, knowledge, and beliefs that would become essential to administration and control. They created a generation accustomed to structure, authority, and a particular worldview. They helped make empire conceivable and manageable without immediate recourse to force. The transformation was quiet, gradual, and pervasive. Education in these early classrooms laid the groundwork for a broader system. They demonstrated that influence could travel through ideas, rather than armies alone. That authority could be learned, internalized, and respected. That loyalty and understanding could be nurtured before enforcement. That influence could be a powerful tool for shaping the world. A new era of control had begun, one that would shape the course of history. The foundations of a lasting empire had been laid, and the future looked bright. In this way, the first classrooms of control were as powerful as any fort, as enduring as any trading post, and as strategic as any fleet. By 1700, the pattern was clear. Mission schools had become more than spaces of learning. They were spaces of influence. They were the quiet beginning of control. Where reading, writing, and religion intertwined. To produce understanding, obedience, and awareness of British authority. The empire's reach was extended not only by trade and military presence, but by the subtle, persistent work of the classroom. Between 1700 and 1800, the Caribbean experienced an educational transformation. Schools appeared beside plantations, in town centers, and near ports. These institutions introduced British language, manners, and social norms, creating a model of behavior that reflected imperial priorities. Education was no longer simply about learning. Some teachers believed they were helping. They saw value in literacy and numeracy, imagining that students could gain skills to navigate life with greater agency. They emphasized reading and writing through religious texts, using repetition and practice to instill familiarity. They celebrated progress when a child learned a lesson or wrote a paragraph correctly. Their classrooms offered guidance, discipline, and instruction intended to prepare students for the world they inhabited. They believed knowledge could open doors, even as those doors were defined by others. Other teachers focused less on individual opportunity and more on maintaining the plantation hierarchy. Lessons were framed to reinforce obedience, punctuality, and respect for authority. European customs became markers of civility, distinguishing those who conformed from those who did not. Education reinforced social boundaries, creating a system where behavior was measured against a standard set far from the Caribbean itself. Knowledge was permitted, but only in forms that supported order and authority. The curriculum prioritized European history, language, and literature. Students learned about distant kings, trade networks, and imperial achievements. They memorized passages from the Bible or English classics while their own stories, traditions, and languages were often ignored. This selective instruction shaped perception. The world was framed through the lens of empire. Students learned which knowledge was valuable, which identity was recognized, and which voices could be heard. Their histories became invisible in the spaces where European models prevailed. Discipline and routine were central. Classrooms were organized with benches, slates, and strict schedules. Lessons began and ended with ritualized order. Punctuality, attentiveness, and the ability to follow instructions were as important as literacy. Failure to comply carried consequences. Respect for authority was cultivated alongside reading ability. Education became a ladder, but one with rungs placed by someone else. The height a student could reach was determined by adherence to rules rather than individual talent or curiosity. Parents and families experienced these schools differently. Some encouraged attendance, seeing literacy as a practical skill for negotiation, record-keeping, or communication. Others were cautious, wary of foreign influence or concerned about lessons that undermined local practices. Children returned home with new language skills, but also with exposure to behaviors and expectations that might conflict with family traditions. Education introduced both opportunity and tension. Missionaries and teachers occupied a complex role. Some genuinely sought to improve students' lives, advocating for moral guidance, basic healthcare, and care in times of illness. Others consciously supported the social structure, aligning lessons with the needs of plantation owners and colonial administrators. The overlap between instruction and control meant that classrooms became microcosms of the broader society. Authority and education were intertwined, shaping conduct, expectation, and aspiration. The influence of these schools extended beyond the classroom. Students carried manners, language, and knowledge into marketplaces, ports, and homes. Letters written in English spread new vocabulary. Behavioral norms established in lessons guided interactions with adults and peers. Religious instruction shaped moral reasoning and daily practice. The classroom experience became a rehearsal for participation in the systems defined by colonial society. Skills were learned, but they came with boundaries that students were expected to respect. At the same time, students adapted and resisted in subtle ways. Some memorized lessons but applied them selectively, using literacy to support their own understanding or protect their community. Some blended European customs with local practice, creating hybrid forms of expression. Others preserved stories, songs, and rituals outside the formal school environment. Education could not fully erase culture, even when it tried to prioritize imperial models. Knowledge moved through interpretation, not simple absorption. By the mid-18th century, Caribbean schools had established enduring patterns. Literacy, manners, and European social norms became tools of both opportunity and limitation. The classroom taught more than letters. It taught compliance, expectation, and the hierarchy of value. Students learned the language of empire, but their ability to navigate the world depended on their willingness to operate within the structures that had been imposed. Education became a filter as well as a ladder. Families, communities, and students negotiated these lessons. Success often required careful adherence. Creativity, memory, and intellect mattered. But only within the boundaries defined by the system. Education was an instrument of social shaping, linking learning to labor, discipline, and conduct. It reinforced power while offering limited mobility. Opportunity and constraint existed side by side in every classroom. Between 1700 and 1800, Caribbean schools created a generation familiar with European language and behavior. Some teachers sought to help students navigate life. Others reinforced the structures of plantation society. Students learned knowledge, but the framework for its use was determined by others. Education became a ladder with boundaries set by authority. Learning offered access, but only within the gate that empire had constructed. Faith, language, and behavior combined to shape both minds and society. Illustrating how instruction could guide, control, and influence in equal measure. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, a new era began across India. Mission schools and administrative institutions spread through Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. Classrooms became more than spaces for learning, they became tools of influence, preparing students for participation in the empire. English language learning emerged as a cornerstone of this system, shaping how people learned, worked, and understood their place in the world. 1757 to 1835. Students practiced reading, writing, and conversation in a language that connected them to distant administrators and offices. Arithmetic, geography, and European history were added to the curriculum. These subjects were practical, designed to create clerks, interpreters, and assistants capable of operating within imperial structures. Knowledge became a bridge between opportunity and loyalty. By 1835, a major transformation had taken hold. English became the official medium of higher education across British-controlled territories. Universities and colleges implemented policies requiring students to master English to access advanced study and government employment. A student could rise to influence, serve in courts, or work in administration, but only by navigating a system structured in a language and framework set far from home. The classroom had become a gateway into imperial life. Classrooms produced more than employees. They produced understanding of the mechanisms of governance. Students learned how records were kept, how correspondence flowed, how decisions were made. They became intermediaries, able to interpret, translate, and implement policies for both local populations and colonial authorities. The empire depended on these graduates to maintain communication, efficiency, and stability. Education had become both instruction and infrastructure. Missionaries and schoolmasters emphasized discipline, moral instruction, and order. Lessons combined technical knowledge with ethical guidance. Students were encouraged to adopt habits that mirrored those of the administrators who ran the empire. Reading and writing exercises extended beyond academics. They shaped comportment, reasoning, and worldview. For families, the new system offered promise. A child who mastered English could access higher wages, administrative roles, and social mobility. Opportunities expanded, but they required adjustment. Local identity, language, and tradition had to coexist with the new framework. Success often meant adapting to a world where the rules, the language, and the expectations originated in distant offices. Belonging to this world was both a chance and a challenge. Traditional forms of education continued to exist alongside British schools. Sanskrit institutions and madrasas preserved languages, literature, and law that had guided communities for generations. They maintained cultural memory, but the momentum shifted toward the institutions connected to colonial administration. Employment and advancement became tied to participation in English-language education. Knowledge became a means to move forward, but within a prescribed system. The transformation was gradual, reinforced by repetition and consistency. Lessons reinforced the priorities of empire. Maps depicted territories in relation to London. Textbooks highlighted European history and governance. Students learned to see the world through a framework aligned with imperial objectives. Authority became visible not only in courts and offices, but in the daily rhythm of classrooms, assignments, and examinations. As students progressed, they acquired skills that empowered them, but also bound them. Fluency in English opened doors, but it also carried expectations. Literacy and administrative practices allowed graduates to function effectively within imperial structures. The more skilled a student became, the more they were integrated into the system. Education, in this sense, was a path forward that required alignment with the values and processes of the empire. By 1835, the impact was evident. Graduates occupied positions across civil services, legal offices, and commercial institutions. They administered revenue, interpreted documents, and maintained the records that allowed governance to function. English language instruction had become both a standard and a prerequisite for influence. The classroom had become a model for preparing people to participate in, and sometimes enforce, the empire. Yet this system had consequences beyond employment. Students learned ways of thinking and communicating that connected them across regions. They observed discrepancies between principles and practice. They began to recognize patterns of authority and structure. Knowledge that trained compliance also created awareness. Literacy, reasoning, and familiarity with governance could eventually serve both administration and critique. The education strategy between 1757 and 1835 reshaped India. Classrooms became central to the empire's influence. They trained clerks, interpreters, and administrators. They instilled language, skill, and procedure. They offered opportunity, but that opportunity was inseparable from a new world defined by British authority. Belonging to this world required participation, adaptation, and alignment. After the Battle of Plassey, schools spread across key cities. English language learning prepared students for government service. By 1835, English became the foundation of higher education. Classrooms produced those who could operate within imperial systems. Students gained opportunity, but the cost was belonging to a new world. India had become the classroom of empire. And through those classrooms, the empire extended its reach into the minds, skills, and identities of future generations. Africa and the missionary wave between 1800 and 1900 unfolds as a story of movement, belief, and preparation. Missionaries often traveled deep into regions far from the coast long before governments arrived. They carried supplies, books, and medicines across rivers, plains, and forests. They established schools and churches in places where maps marked uncertainty. Every mission station became a foothold, a place where faith and instruction traveled together, shaping the land before authority could claim it. Schools opened first. Children learned to read, write, and calculate in ways that were previously unfamiliar. Lessons focus on scripture alongside basic literacy, introducing letters and words that travel beyond the home. These classrooms are small but significant. They become spaces where knowledge, habit, and expectation intertwine. Through education, missionaries provide tools that empower, yet also align with foreign values. Learning becomes a bridge to a world that is not yet fully present, a preview of authority to come. They offer a place to gather, to pray, and to hear stories told from a perspective different from local traditions. For some, the church is a refuge and a source of guidance. For others, it is a foreign presence, an institution that teaches new customs alongside new beliefs. Faith travels not only through words, but through the rhythms of worship, the organization of space, and the practices it encourages. Medical care accompanies instruction. Clinics open where once only traditional healers attended. Missionaries treat fevers, infections, and injuries. The care offered is tangible, immediate, and appreciated. Communities experience benefits that are real and lasting. Medicine builds trust, softening the arrival of outsiders and creating networks of reliance. Healing becomes a means of influence, and influence arrives before governance. Not all missionaries approach their work in the same way. Some genuinely seek to help, to teach, and to understand. They adapt lessons to local languages and customs, listening and learning as they proceed. Others judge traditions through a foreign lens. They dismiss practices they do not understand and encourage behaviors that align with European ideals. They see civilization and morality as inseparable from their own culture. And they seek to impose both through education and instruction. Education arrives before empire fully does. Before flags are planted or officials establish offices. Children are already learning skills, languages, and ideas that will shape their future interactions. Literacy and knowledge provide opportunity. But they also establish familiarity with systems that the colonial administration will later expand. Students grow accustomed to rules, routines, and hierarchies that are foreign to older ways of life. The classroom becomes a subtle form of preparation, a space where the future presence of empire is already imagined. Communities respond in complex ways. Some embrace the new knowledge, integrating it into daily life. They see literacy as a tool to navigate trade, communication, and social change. They participate in worship and take lessons seriously, adapting them to local culture. Others maintain distance, keeping traditions alive at home while participating only as necessary. Resistance is not always open or dramatic. By the middle of the century, missionary networks expand. Supply routes improve. Missionaries communicate with headquarters in Europe, sending reports, maps, and letters. Churches and schools become nodes in a growing web, linking distant lands to overseas centers of faith and planning. The work that begins as spiritual and educational slowly takes on strategic significance. Lays the groundwork for influence before administration arrives. The connection between education and authority becomes more evident as infrastructure improves. Roads built to reach mission stations are later used by officials. Children trained in literacy and arithmetic enter roles as clerks, translators, and guides once colonial offices are established. The preparation is subtle but effective. Empire is reinforced not by force alone, but by familiarity, habit, and expectation. Missionaries are not soldiers, yet their work shapes the terrain for those who follow. By the final decades of the 19th century, the missionary wave has transformed landscapes, societies, and identities. Christianity spreads widely, literacy becomes common, and medical care introduces new expectations. Communities are changed before flags fly and law offices open. Faith and instruction move forward together, shaping generations in ways that endure beyond the century. The missionary wave creates foundations that outlast the missions themselves. Churches remain, schools continue, and trained local leaders take over responsibilities once held by foreigners. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Medicine heals, knowledge empowers, and new customs spread alongside belief. The work that arrived in the early 1800s does not disappear with the end of missionary administration. Instead, it evolves, becoming part of community identity, intertwined with language, learning, and belief. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Medicine heals, knowledge empowers, and new customs spread alongside belief. The work that arrived in the early 1800s does not disappear with the end of missionary administration. Instead, it evolves, becoming part of community identity, intertwined with language, learning, and belief. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Medicine heals, knowledge empowers, and new customs spread alongside belief. The work that arrived in the early 1800s does not disappear with the end of missionary administration. Instead, it evolves, becoming part of community identity, intertwined with language, learning, and belief. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Medicine heals, knowledge empowers, and new customs spread alongside belief. The work that arrived in the early 1800s does not disappear with the end of missionary administration. Instead, it evolves, becoming part of community identity, intertwined with language, learning, and belief. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Medicine heals, knowledge empowers, and new customs spread alongside belief. The work that arrived in the early 1800s does not disappear with the end of missionary administration. Instead, it evolves, becoming part of community identity, intertwined with language, learning, and belief. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Medicine heals, knowledge empowers, and new customs spread alongside belief. The work that arrived in the early 1800s does not disappear with the end of missionary administration. Instead, it evolves, becoming part of community identity, intertwined with language, learning, and belief. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Medicine heals, knowledge empowers, and new customs spread alongside belief. The work that arrived in the early 1800s does not disappear with the end of missionary administration. Instead, it evolves, becoming part of community identity, intertwined with language, learning, and belief. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Medicine heals, knowledge empowers, and new customs spread alongside belief. The work that arrived in the early 1800s does not disappear with the end of missionary administration. Instead, it evolves, becoming part of community identity, intertwined with language, learning, and belief. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Medicine heals, knowledge empowers, and new customs spread alongside belief. The work that arrived in the early 1800s does not disappear with the end of missionary administration. Instead, it evolves, becoming part of community identity, intertwined with language, learning, and belief. Education prepares the ground before the flag is planted. Faith arrives like a foundation stone, solid and enduring. Missionaries create networks that link people, places, and ideas long before governance arrives. The wave moves inland, shaping not only how communities learn and worship, but how they will experience the changes that follow. Africa and the missionary wave from 1800 to 1900 is a story of preparation, influence, and adaptation. Schools, churches, and clinics marked the advance of faith before empire, shaping minds and communities, softening transitions, and leaving legacies that will endure for generations. The work is complex, imperfect, and transformative, creating a foundation upon which the century of expansion is built. Textbooks and the Imperial Imagination 1880 to 1914 begins in classrooms across Britain and its colonies, where lessons were as much about shaping thought as they were about teaching reading or arithmetic. By the late 1800s, schools had become a powerful tool in building understanding of the world, a lens carefully focused to highlight the Empyrea's reach and authority. Children opened books that presented facts as certainty and ideas as obligation, quietly constructing the worldview that would sustain imperial ambition for decades. Textbooks praised British leadership. They described victories in distant lands, portraying generals and administrators as figures of wisdom and courage. Pages illustrated colonial landscapes with orderly settlements, productive farms, and thriving ports. Lessons framed conquest not as coercion, but as guidance. Children read about wars fought thousands of miles away without leaving their village, absorbing the Empyrea's authority as natural and just. Maps reinforced this perspective. Arrows traced trade routes, lines marked borders, and colonies spread outward like spokes on a wheel. The visual representation of empire suggested control, order, and reach. Even without leaving their desks, students could see the extent of British power. Distance was irrelevant. Knowledge replaced experience, and in its place grew a sense of centrality and importance for the metropole. History lessons favored the Empyrea's perspective. Events were narrated to highlight British bravery, strategy, and benevolence. Conflicts were framed as struggles for order. Administration was described as guidance, taxation as stewardship, and cultural exchange as enlightenment. The voices of colonized peoples were often absent, replaced by the language of justification. Empires were presented as inevitable, beneficial, and morally upright. Children learned not only what happened, but how to interpret it. Science, geography, and literature classes also reflected imperial priorities. Geography emphasized global resources and trade routes. Science connected discoveries to colonial projects, illustrating plants, animals, and minerals as objects of study and exploitation. Literature celebrated explorers, administrators, and missionaries, creating heroes whose journeys carried moral as well as practical lessons. These subjects intertwined to produce a worldview where British influence seemed natural, necessary, and unquestionable. A child did not need to see a war to believe in a ruler. They did not need to witness conquest to accept its legitimacy. Lessons, exercises, and illustrations worked together to embed consent for authority. Repetition, rhythm, and storytelling created familiarity with imperial structures. Knowledge itself became a mechanism of consent. Education did not shout. It whispered. It normalized. It framed obedience as understanding, compliance as insight, and authority as reason. Schoolrooms themselves supported the message. Walls displayed maps, charts, and portraits. Globes sat in corners, highlighting seas and colonies. Teachers reinforced the material with questions, recitations, and commentary. A child absorbed this environment daily. Authority and empire became as much a part of life as reading and arithmetic. Lessons shaped perception before experience could challenge it. In India, Africa, and the Caribbean, textbooks mirrored those used in Britain. Students learned English, arithmetic, and history through the lens of empire. Curriculum emphasized loyalty, duty, and service. Stories from local regions were reframed to highlight imperial perspective. Students learned that the world was interconnected, but that connections were measured through British authority. Knowledge traveled along the lines of power. Yet education also created unexpected outcomes. Literacy and learning provided tools for communication and organization. Some students used their knowledge to navigate systems of administration. Advocate for communities, or, later, challenge imperial structures. Understanding authority allowed them to question it. Education built consent, but it also built capacity for change. The very books that shaped obedience laid the groundwork for independence movements decades later. Textbooks, maps, and classrooms worked together to produce a generation familiar with the empire before they had ever encountered it. Reading became a rehearsal for understanding hierarchy. Writing became a rehearsal for administration. Memorization became a rehearsal for compliance. Children internalized a sense of order, of purpose, and of place within a global system controlled by distant authority. Between 1880 and 1914, schooling did more than teach. It framed reality. It positioned the British metropole at the center of knowledge, history, and morality. It conveyed values, expectations, and priorities with subtlety and repetition. Education was both the tool and the stage on which imperial imagination unfolded. Learning and loyalty traveled hand in hand, quietly shaping thought and identity across generations. A child educated in these schools could visualize London as the heart of the world, understand administration without experience, and internalize moral narratives that justified power. Knowledge became power, and power became normal. Authority needed no army to reinforce it in these classrooms. The empire was embedded in the mind before it was ever encountered in the world. Education quietly built consent. It taught admiration, comprehension, and deference as naturally as it taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. It created citizens who knew the world only through a lens shaped by imperial purpose. Maps, lessons, and stories combined to make belief in empire habitual, unquestioned, and enduring. Language and Loyalty 1850 to 1900. The story begins in classrooms across the empire, where children sat at wooden desks with slates and inkpots, learning a language that stretched far beyond their villages. English was more than words. It was a gateway, a tool, and a measure of opportunity. Those who mastered it could read documents, write letters, negotiate contracts, and communicate with officials who held power. It offered access to jobs in administration, trade, and education. It promised social mobility in a world increasingly organized by the empire's systems. But learning English also carried cost. For many students, it created distance from older languages. From the words their parents and grandparents used to tell stories and pass knowledge. Folk tales, prayers, and histories once shared in native tongues became harder to access. Idioms, rhythms, and nuances disappeared from everyday life. Language became a bridge to the empire, and a wall between generations. Understanding the empire came at the expense of understanding Oni's own past. As generations changed, identity shifted alongside vocabulary. A child who could speak fluently in English navigated both worlds, but never fully rooted in either. At home, older family members continued using native words. This duality shaped behavior, choices, and aspirations. It transformed how individuals saw themselves and how they were seen by others. The classroom became a space of subtle influence. Teachers emphasized pronunciation, grammar, and usage in ways that mirrored official expectations. Lessons included history written from the British perspective, reinforcing loyalty through language. Every exercise in spelling or reading was also a lesson in alignment with the Empire's worldview. Mastery of vocabulary became mastery of expectation. Speaking English correctly was no longer merely practical, it was a form of allegiance. To rise in the world, a child had to speak like the empire. Letters of application, reports, and introductions required formal speech. Negotiations demanded understanding of specific terminology. Markets, offices, and government posts were navigable only with fluency. Language functioned as a key, unlocking doors that remained closed to those who could not wield it. Success became inseparable from adoption of the Empire's tongue. Learning thus became both opportunity and surrender. Students gained mobility, but ceded part of cultural heritage. Words taught in school replaced some words taught at home. Concepts introduced in English reframed the familiar world. Education reshaped perception, molding the way children thought about society, authority, and self. Knowledge of English created advantage, but also aligned identity with structures imposed from afar. The effects of language extended beyond individuals. Families observed as younger members integrated new words and phrases into conversation. Elders noticed shifts in humor, etiquette, and priorities. Communities adjusted as the next generation interpreted their world through vocabulary shaped elsewhere. Schools carefully selected the texts and stories used for instruction. Lessons in morality, history, and civics emphasized loyalty, obedience, and service. Narratives positioned Britain as orderly, just, and benevolent. Foreign lands were presented as places of learning and guidance. English became not only a practical skill but a lens through which to interpret the world. Understanding words meant understanding the empire's expectations. Yet, adaptation did not always erase resistance. Some students retained fluency in native languages, balancing heritage with acquired skill. Storytelling, music, and cultural practices persisted in private spaces. Parents and elders sought to preserve knowledge, passing down language through informal instruction. Bilingualism became a form of negotiation, allowing young people to move in imperial spaces while maintaining ties to their roots. Language was both tool and terrain, contested and negotiated. By the late 19th century, English had become a powerful instrument of cultural alignment. It shaped not only communication but behavior, aspiration, and loyalty. Fluency opened opportunities, but also reinforced hierarchy. Those who spoke with authority in English were positioned closer to centers of influence. Those who did not, remained constrained by circumstance and access. Mastery of the language became inseparable from understanding Oni's place in the world as the empire defined it. The classroom itself became a site of subtle socialization. Daily routines, exercises, and recitations reinforced discipline and attention to detail. Students internalized the empire's rhythm and logic, absorbing order alongside vocabulary. Education in English cultivated a shared framework for interpreting rules, relationships, and authority. It shaped thought processes as much as it shaped speech. As generations passed, this system created lasting effects. Language reshaped identity across regions, linking mobility with imperial culture. Children who mastered English gained new confidence, new social networks, and new avenues for influence. Communities transformed as younger members bridged worlds of tradition and opportunity. The empire's power became embedded not only in law and administration, but in the everyday words people used to navigate life. By 1900, the patterns were clear. English functioned as both a pathway and a boundary. It created access and enforced expectation. Learning the language meant learning how to participate in the empire's structure. And also how to align with its values. Every sentence read, every phrase spoken, reinforced a system in which loyalty was inseparable from vocabulary. Language, therefore, was never neutral. It was instruction and influence. It was opportunity and obligation. And in classrooms across continents, it quietly prepared generations to participate in, and reproduce. The Empire. Mastery of English was mastery of possibility and mastery of submission to the world the Empire imagined. Between 1900 and 1930, colonial education shifted from general instruction to a system defined by examination. Colonial governments introduced formal exams as a way to control who could enter administration, law, medicine, and teaching. Schools trained students for this moment, focusing lessons, discipline, and practice on preparing them to pass. Success meant more than knowledge. It meant approval. It meant recognition by a system designed to filter and select, to decide who could advance and who remained outside authority. Classrooms became oriented toward the examination hall. Teachers emphasized memorization, precision, and adherence to instruction. Every lesson carried the weight of consequence. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and imperial history were taught not only as subjects, but as tools to demonstrate conformity. Students learned that failure was not simply an absence of knowledge. It was a signal that access to opportunity had been denied. Every test became a gate, every mark a step toward inclusion or exclusion. Parents and families understood the stakes. They encouraged study, offered guidance, and arranged time for preparation. Some invested in private tutors or extra materials. Travel to schools could be long and arduous, yet attendance was seen as essential. The exam was both a promise and a threat. Those who mastered the system could rise, moving from classrooms to offices, from instruction to responsibility. Those who failed often remained in marginal positions, capable and skilled, but unable to claim official authority. The system rewarded acceptance of imperial instruction. Students were expected to internalize the methods, language, and values defined by the colonial authorities. Success was conditional. Knowledge alone was not enough. Discipline, obedience, and alignment with the system's priorities were equally important. The exam became a measure not only of ability, but of conformity. Those who passed demonstrated that they understood the rules and would operate within them, reinforcing structures that extended imperial control. Examinations were formal events. Papers were distributed. Strict timing was enforced. And invigilation ensured adherence to procedure. Silence prevailed in rooms filled with desks and slates, or benches in colonial schools. The atmosphere carried tension, expectation, and pressure. Outside, families waited for results that could define futures. Success opened positions of authority and social mobility. Failure closed doors that were otherwise visible but inaccessible. The examination system shaped ambition, behavior, and aspiration simultaneously. Teachers occupied a complex role. They were both guides and enforcers. They prepared students for advancement, while reinforcing obedience to curriculum and procedure. Some were genuinely invested in intellectual development and moral instruction. Others aligned closely with administrative priorities, shaping behavior as well as knowledge. In classrooms, the lesson plan and the authority of the system merged. Students learned to navigate both, balancing personal understanding with the requirements imposed from above. The examination system created a hierarchy of opportunity. Students who passed could enter government offices, legal institutions, and teaching roles. Their presence reinforced colonial structures and ensured that administration operated with personnel trained in the methods and expectations of the metropole. Those who failed were often relegated to local or subordinate positions. The system produced professionals who carried authority while maintaining loyalty to the framework that had granted it. Access came with responsibility to function within prescribed boundaries. Resistance to the system existed in subtle ways. Some studied selectively, adopting methods that advanced them while preserving personal perspective. Communities built informal networks to support learning, sharing knowledge and strategies beyond formal instruction. Success could be adapted to serve local aims as well as imperial ones, even while the gates remained controlled by colonial authorities. The examination system also shaped identity. Students learned to see themselves through the lens of evaluation. Achievement became tied to measured performance. Self-worth was often linked to marks and certificates. Authority was tied to recognition, creating a feedback loop where compliance enabled advancement, and advancement reinforced compliance. Learning was a ladder, but the rungs were placed and judged by others. The gate was visible, its key held elsewhere. By the 1920s, the examination system had become entrenched. Schools prepared students for official tests. Administrators used exam results to fill positions. And the process defined the pace of careers. Education became both opportunity and filter, offering potential while limiting access. Those who entered the system often did so knowing the rules and adjusting behavior to meet expectations. Those outside the system were aware of the possibilities, but had no authority to claim them. The examination system left a legacy beyond individual careers. It shaped social hierarchies, reinforced colonial governance, and influenced cultural perception of education. It demonstrated that knowledge alone did not determine advancement. Alignment with systems, conformity to method, and recognition by authority defined access. Education opened the gate, but someone else held the key. Between 1900 and 1930, colonial examinations revealed the dual nature of instruction. They provided learning and advancement while simultaneously controlling who could exercise authority. The system rewarded acceptance, disciplined ambition, and maintained order. It taught that opportunity came with conditions, and that success required more than intelligence or effort. To pass was to enter power. To fail was to remain outside. Education was both a ladder and a filter, a gateway to authority and a mirror of the system that designed it. Resistance, debate, and new voices 1910 to 1940. Between 1910 and 1940, classrooms across the empire became unexpected arenas of change. The British administration had intended education to produce loyal subjects. Schools taught English, law, administration, and civics. Missionaries and officials believed that literacy, discipline, and exposure to European systems would cultivate obedience. The plan seemed clear. The outcome was different. Students absorbed more than facts and figures. They absorbed frameworks for reasoning, debate, and persuasion. A lesson in law taught them the principles of justice and due process. A lesson in history taught them about rights, governance, and social structures. A lesson in English gave them the ability to articulate complex ideas, to address audiences beyond their immediate surroundings. What was meant to shape loyalty became a foundation for questioning authority. In India, young graduates from mission schools and universities began to explore the contradictions within colonial law. They learned how systems were supposed to function, and compared that to the realities around them. Discrepancies became evidence, and knowledge became a tool. Lawyers, scholars, and activists used the frameworks they had been taught to argue for fairness, reform, and eventually independence. The classroom had trained them to navigate the empire, and that skill was now applied to challenge it. Across West Africa, in places like Ghana and Nigeria, schools provided access to literacy and communication that had not previously been widespread. Students mastered English and gained exposure to ideas of citizenship, rights, and governance. They wrote articles for newspapers, participated in debate societies, and organized meetings that questioned colonial policies. Education produced leaders who could translate their understanding into action, whose voices carried authority and conviction. In the Caribbean, students trained in mission schools and secondary institutions began to form networks that spanned islands and countries. They discussed social, political, and economic inequalities. They founded newspapers, literary clubs, and associations that critiqued local administration. The knowledge they had acquired enabled them to frame arguments in ways the empire understood, giving resistance a voice that could not be ignored. The process was gradual. It began with curiosity, expanded through dialogue, and emerged in organized debate. Students questioned the assumptions underlying governance. They analyzed reports, memorized laws, and studied precedent. They understood the language of administration, and that understanding allowed them to identify inconsistencies. Education had equipped them with tools the empire had not anticipated being used in opposition. Missionaries and colonial authorities had aimed to instill a sense of duty and allegiance. Moral instruction accompanied lessons in arithmetic and grammar. Schools emphasized order, character, and respect. They hoped that values would align with compliance. Yet these moral teachings also highlighted contradictions. If fairness and justice were virtues, why were they selectively applied? If governance required accountability, why were voices silenced? Students began to ask questions that grew louder with each year. By the 1920s, debates within classrooms and among graduates had. Graduates applied their skills in courts, assemblies, and civic institutions. They addressed inequalities, demanded representation, and argued for self-determination. Education had intended to produce subjects. It produced citizens with the knowledge to claim their rights. In India, leaders emerged who combined mastery of English and understanding of law to challenge colonial authority. In Ghana and Nigeria, intellectuals used newspapers and pamphlets to advocate for social and political reforms. In the Caribbean, educators and students engaged in dialogue that questioned traditional hierarchies. Across continents, the classroom had become the starting point for movements that sought change. The paradox of the period was clear. The empire had sought to train obedient subjects. Instead, it trained individuals capable of reasoning, articulating, and organizing. Schools created networks of communication that could be mobilized for reform. Skills intended for administration were applied to independence movements. The very tools of compliance became instruments of challenge. By 1940, a new generation of leaders had emerged from the classrooms established by the empire. They had studied English, law, history, and governance. They had absorbed the frameworks of administration. And they had learned how to use those frameworks to question the system itself. Education had produced understanding, awareness, and strategy. Authority had been taught, and resistance had been learned. Students used the very education they gained to demand freedom. In Ghana, India, Nigeria, and the Caribbean, educated leaders became voices of resistance. The classroom that once served empire became the place where opposition was born. The empire had intended to shape loyalty. It created the architects of change. And through debate, knowledge, and new voices, the empire discovered that education does not always serve its creator. The end of empire, the survival of schools, stretches from 1947 to 1970, a period of transformation and continuity. In 1947, India gains independence. The flag changes, the government shifts, and a nation begins to chart its own path. Across Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, other countries follow, asserting sovereignty and shaping futures once dictated from distant capitals. The empire falls. Political control recedes. Authority no longer flows from London. Yet, in classrooms across these newly independent nations, traces of imperial influence remain. Schools do not vanish when the empire does. Buildings, teachers, and curricula persist. Students still enter classrooms built decades earlier. With desks, blackboards, and walls that echo lessons once designed for colonial administration. It continues to guide minds, structure days, and influence generations. In many ways, schools become the bridge between the past and the future. Curricula are rewritten. Local histories replace distant narratives. Languages that were once discouraged are restored to lessons. Stories, traditions, and knowledge suppressed under colonial rule reappear. Teachers adapt materials to reflect national identity, pride, and culture. Geography shifts focus from foreign capitals to rivers, mountains, and cities within the nation itself. Literature incorporates voices that were once absent from official syllabi. Education becomes a space to reclaim identity. Yet, the structure of the classroom often remains unmistakably familiar. Timetables, subjects, and examinations still follow models inherited from the empire. Grammar lessons, arithmetic exercises, and written assessments retain their format. School uniforms, assembly routines, and administrative hierarchies mirror those established decades earlier. The rhythm of learning continues as it once did, even as the content begins to change. Empire survives in the architecture of daily life, quietly shaping experience long after its political authority has ended. Teachers carry the task of transformation. Many were trained under colonial systems, and must now guide students in a new national framework. They translate lessons, modify examples, and introduce local context. They balance inherited methods with modern needs, preserving useful structures while giving space for identity to grow. The work is careful, deliberate, and sometimes contentious. Each classroom becomes a microcosm of national negotiation between past and future. Students navigate a dual world. At home, they speak languages and follow traditions restored after independence. At school, they encounter methods, subjects, and routines rooted in colonial practice. Success often depends on mastering both spheres. Exams may still reward memorization, neat handwriting, and answers shaped by a framework built decades earlier. Yet the lessons themselves begin to reflect local experience, connecting education to life outside the classroom. The influence of empire also survives through textbooks and teaching materials. Publishers continue producing books using the familiar formats established under colonial systems. Maps, illustrations, and examples echo previous priorities, even as they are adapted to include new histories, cities, and figures. Knowledge, once framed to serve imperial understanding, gradually reorients to serve independent nations. The process is uneven, evolving year by year. Across countries, governments invest in teacher training, curriculum development, and school expansion. Universities and colleges emerge to train educators in a post-colonial context. They create standards, certification processes, and pedagogical models that blend inherited structure with national vision. Education becomes both a tool for empowerment and a reflection of continuity. The past shapes methods even as content shifts toward identity and self-determination. Communities observe and influence change. Parents advocate for lessons in local languages, histories, and arts. Civic leaders demand that schools reflect the experiences and values of the nation rather than the distant empire. Students grow up understanding both worlds, the legacy of colonial education and the possibilities of independent learning. The classroom becomes a space where negotiation, adaptation, and identity intersect. By the 1960s, the transformation is visible but incomplete. Schools remain physically and structurally reminiscent of empire. Exams, schedules, and disciplinary practices retain their familiar forms. Yet the spirit of education has shifted. Students study national history, celebrate local achievements, and speak languages once suppressed. Curricula are dynamic, reflecting the aspirations of new nations while guided by enduring methods. The survival of schools illustrates a paradox of post-colonial life. Empire may fall politically, but its systems continue to shape daily experience. Learning remains framed by inherited structures even as it incorporates the knowledge, languages, and traditions of independent nations. Classrooms carry both memory and possibility, bridging the continuity of method with the change of content. Between 1947 and 1970, classrooms become laboratories of identity. They preserve methods from the past while cultivating citizens for the future. They embody the resilience of educational structures, showing that institutions can outlast political authority. The empire may have ended, but in the rhythm of school bells, the order of lessons, and the architecture of education, its imprint survives. In this era, nations reclaim their voices within classrooms. Teachers, students, and communities shape the content, context, and purpose of learning. Empire no longer dictates governance, yet it continues to influence form. The survival of schools demonstrates that structures endure, and through them, generations navigate the legacy of the past while building the knowledge of the future. A legacy still felt today begins in classrooms, offices, and courts across the world where the influence of a bygone era continues to shape daily life. Former colonies carry systems of education, law, and governance inherited from British rule. Exams are modeled on standards set a century ago. University curricula follow structures introduced during colonial administration. Legal training emphasizes procedures and terminology that originated under foreign authority. These frameworks survive because they function, because they connect generations, and because they provide continuity in an ever-changing world. English remains a global language of opportunity. It opens doors to higher education, international business, and cross-border communication. Students in Lagos, Mumbai, Kingston, and Nairobi grow up learning to read and write in English. They read textbooks, access research, and communicate with peers across continents. The language is not simply a tool of expression. It is a bridge, a passport to networks, and a symbol of global participation. For some, this is a step forward. For others, it is a reminder of a past that imposed its structures on identity, culture, and daily life. Education built futures. It enabled children from small towns to study abroad. It allowed individuals to navigate bureaucracies, pursue careers in law, medicine, and business, and enter global conversations that would otherwise have been inaccessible. It created pathways to mobility, social influence, and personal achievement. The opportunities were real, tangible, and life-changing. But education also wrote over some of those futures. Languages, customs, and ways of thinking that existed for generations were diminished or reframed. Lessons often presented one worldview as superior to others. Students learned to navigate systems designed for another context, sometimes at the cost of local knowledge. The curriculum, the exams, the forms of discipline, and the models of success carried embedded assumptions about culture, authority, and hierarchy. Identity was reshaped quietly, lesson by lesson, page by page. The legacy is uneven. In some regions, local adaptations have blended colonial structures with indigenous knowledge and cultural priorities. Schools teach mathematics or science alongside local history, languages, and arts. Universities grant degrees in both traditional subjects and programs developed to serve contemporary national needs. In other areas, colonial frameworks dominate more completely, leaving little room for reinterpretation. Students graduate with knowledge and credentials that are globally recognized, but also carry traces of an external worldview. The story of colonial classrooms is not only history. It is memory. It exists in the way adults recall the schools they attended. It is present in the methods teachers still use. It resonates in the expectations that shape exams, assessments, and achievement. The influence lingers in the architecture of campuses, the structure of school years, and the hierarchy of academic authority. These are tangible remnants of a system designed to organize thought, behavior, and opportunity. Beyond schools, the legacy extends to law and governance. Legal systems maintain terminology, courtroom procedure, and codes introduced during imperial administration. Judges trained under these systems operate in ways shaped by precedent, emphasizing structure and consistency. Civil service models and bureaucratic practices follow templates created for efficiency and oversight in the past. They continue to organize national and local governance, linking generations of professionals to a shared framework. For individuals, this legacy has personal implications. Education can empower, yet it can also create internal conflict. Students learn to navigate worlds that value foreign norms alongside local traditions. They may achieve globally recognized success while negotiating identity and belonging. The frameworks that offer advantage also carry the weight of history. They remind citizens of a time when authority and opportunity were unevenly distributed. Globally, English language education connects former colonies in ways. Academics publish. Students exchange ideas. And businesses operate across borders. Trade, research, and technology are conducted in a shared medium, facilitating collaboration. And language itself is a tool of connectivity. Yet it also signals the presence of influence rooted in a historical hierarchy. Memory and reflection shape how this legacy is understood. Educators, historians, and policymakers examine the effects of colonial education. They ask questions about inclusion, cultural preservation, and adaptation. Some argue that the frameworks should be maintained for their utility. Others advocate for reform that reflects local identity and contemporary values. The debate continues because the past persists in everyday structures, influencing decision-making, teaching, and social expectations. This legacy also carries opportunity for reinterpretation. Curricula are updated, teaching methods modernized, and new subjects introduced. Communities reclaim language, culture, and history, blending them with inherited systems. Students learn to navigate both local and global worlds. The foundations remain, but the use of those foundations evolves. In this way, the past becomes a tool, not only a memory, shaping how societies move forward. A legacy still felt today is layered, complex, and ongoing. It exists in language, law, and administrative structures. It is visible in both opportunity and constraint, in progress and pressure. Education built futures, yet it also wrote over some of them. The story is neither simple nor singular. It is lived, experienced, and continually negotiated. A legacy still felt today is layered, complex, and ongoing. The story of colonial classrooms is not only history. It is memory. It is part of identity, performance, and aspiration. It shapes what individuals know, what communities value, and how nations organize themselves. It carries forward into contemporary life, quietly influencing thought, opportunity, and perception. Education continues to build, reshape, and connect. History remains. Memory endures. The legacy is still felt today. Thank you for being here and listening to this chapter of history. Teaching empire to the colonized was not done with swords or ships. It was done with lessons, language, and learning. Some gained knowledge that changed their lives for the better. Others lost pieces of their heritage in the process. The truth lives between these experiences. History is not asked to choose sides. It is asked to be understood. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and take care.